Matters small, micro and medium enterprises and some of the challenges being faced by this segment of the economy and how the businesses are doing. And in studio, I have a panel with me which will help me dissect this subject. I have Gilbert Manirakiza, who is the Chief Executive of Newmark. Welcome to the show. I have Eva Warigia, who is Executive Director of the East African Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. Welcome to the show. And I have Martin Bayer, Associate Director at the Strathmore Business School. Strathmore has been really instrumental in organizing the annual SME conference. So we'll be tapping into that pool, of course, of ideas which have been pulled on that side. And just to begin our conversation, I've been looking at the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics report, which paints what looks like a rather gloomy picture, especially from the small and micro businesses. And they talk about the average life cycle being 3.8 years, which just borders on 4. So ideally, a business gets to 4 years, and for some reason it collapses. If I could start with you, Gilbert, who has been running not just one, but a number of businesses that would be in this category, what has your experience largely been like?
Thank you, Julian, for having me on this distinguished panel. My name is, as you said, Gilbert Manirakiza. I am with the Newmark Group. This is a strategic communications company that has been around for 9 years, where we have been serving companies of different sizes and different landscapes, particularly those that are interested in doing business across borders, that having been our niche. I'm talking about international organizations, multinational companies, local companies that want to do business outside of their local borders. Yeah. We are located here, but we also have a footprint in over 30 African countries, with hub offices in places like Accra, Ghana, as well as here in Nairobi. So coming back to your question, I believe that whenever you are talking about entrepreneurship and whenever you're talking about companies, you first of all have to look at who is going to start that initiative. And from a founder's perspective, having been one of the founders of the company, I have to say that the startup phase is usually very hazy. You don't always see exactly where things are going. And I have to admit that Kenya is one of the countries where you have the easiest processes in terms of doing business in Africa, especially speaking from someone who has the benefit of doing business in other countries. So I'd like to start from that point of view, that starting a business, particularly here in Kenya, is not a very complicated process, particularly over the last few years. We've been around for 9 years, and I've seen how the government has introduced many processes to make it easier. Currently, Kenya is ranked 4th in Africa by the World Bank in terms of ease of doing business. So from a startup perspective, I would say that it's one of the ecosystems that offers entrepreneurs the best landscape. Perhaps when you are talking about scaling up, there could be a nuance there, because you have to start thinking about are entrepreneurs or founders supported enough by the ecosystem, by the policies that exist? I would say that that's a relative question. Okay. There are some who thrive in the current ecosystem and in the sectors that they are in, and there are those who don't necessarily find everything conducive. For us, I would say that we found the ecosystem quite conducive, because it's a competitive market. If you have a solid product to offer and you're positioning yourself, you're learning every day, you're bringing the right service to the market, you will actually grow and survive. Yeah. However, if you don't manage to stay afloat, you might actually, particularly from a cash flow perspective, that's something that many people don't always think about. And there are things that affect cash flow, things like taxes, things like suppliers, things like how you negotiate with the people that you work with, and also things like how you negotiate with your clients for the best deals and so forth. So I would say that startup, not so complicated. Staying in business, that will depend on the entrepreneur.
I see. Yeah. And Eva, just to get your quick thoughts around this, he's really painted a good landscape in terms of the startup phase vis-a-vis scaling beyond that particular, if I could call it the incubation period. And you sit at a platform whereby, I'd imagine, we have key players who are always scouting for opportunities as to where do we put in our capital on the next promising business. What are some of the things you normally see when you're doing this kind of scouting?
All right, thanks. So the East Africa Venture Capital Association is an umbrella body for private equity and venture capital investors. We have a mandate across East Africa, looking at 5 countries: Ethiopia, Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. From what we're looking at is some of the things Gilbert mentioned, sustainability beyond the idea phase. Like he said, it's very easy for someone to get an idea and get it rolling because we have the infrastructure from policy, internet that can facilitate for that. But now the sustainability of that idea is what we call to question. The other thing that we've noticed is the election cycle tends to have an influence. So we have investment, or rather we have people who start a business, but then generally from an economic perspective is every maybe 4th year when we start campaigning, then business slows down, and the big companies feel it, but the small and micro enterprises feel it more. And so when businesses at a macro level slow down, then it has an impact even on their ease of sustaining that idea beyond the 3.84 years.
And I noticed that you're talking about the election year, which is normally 5-year cycles, and we have been told the average age here is 4 years.
Exactly.
So I get what you're
exactly
putting across there. Martin, to come to you, I mean, you interact with this kind of businesses quite often. And some of the things which have been brought up here, the cyclicality which comes into play. When you look at the SME segment from a bird's eye view, what are some of the things you normally observe, just to start off the conversation?
Great. Julian, thank you for this opportunity to be on the show. I wanted to start by underscoring that Strathmore is really focused on being an outcome-driven research institution and is focused on entrepreneurship. It's an entrepreneurial institution. So we've had multiple conversations within the past 2 months, as you rightly brought up. We had an SME conference. That particular conference was focusing on the Big Four agenda, big priority for the country right now, anchored to Vision 2030. One of the key things that came up, and I think if you look at the KNBS report, was the issue of financing. So you're asking, why is this 4-year cycle? Actually, one of the reasons they directly quote in the report is this issue of operating funds. It's being challenged from all directions. Funds have to be put into the business, they have to be channeled to the family, they have to be channeled to pay taxes, all kinds of unexpected issues. Associated with that is the issue of informality. So for a big chunk of these businesses, particularly micro and small, they don't really operate within the formal realm. KRA just had a summit within this past week, and they pointed out the tax base is about 4 million entities, individuals and businesses, grown from about 3 million, compared to the population of the country, even the number of businesses in play. So I think these twin issues of challenges on operating funds and really this challenge between formality and informality. You've got many SMEs that can't access the kind of funds Eva has available through the platform she represents, and you have these companies cannot also operate continentally or regionally in the ways Gilbert was alluding to. So ideas like a continental free trade area, SMEs are not quite clear how do they tap into that. Sustainability, when you think of SDGs and attractiveness to global markets, SMEs are not quite clear how they plug in. So as Strathmore, that has been part of our areas of exploration. How can we provide a structure that offers a path to formality for a lot of these businesses that by the 4-year mark are really at a point that they need a leg up or an environment where they can prosper, but that is lacking.
But Martin, if I could stay with you and this discussion around formality, one of the issues that SMEs normally raise to us is that formality has its implications, yes. And I mean cost-wise, in terms of taxes. You come into the tax net, and of course, KRA is now on your back. Okay. And for many of them, they will tell you, we don't see value for money.
Yes.
Yeah. So why would I formalize if formalization actually implies that then I'm having all these stringent
all these challenges?
Yeah.
I like what where Gilbert started. So Gilbert alluded to this idea that Kenya is one of the most competitive markets in the context of East Africa. So SMEs in Kenya, I think, have it reasonably well. In spite of that, it's a challenging environment. Formality is good for a simple reason. It provides structure. It provides a path that particularly big capital, the kind of capital that Eva is operating with, can quantify risks and returns in a very predictable way. To your question on KRA, I wanted to commend KRA from one perspective. Just this past week, they had the summit I alluded to earlier, and it was a very robust conversation. One of their very first panels looked at this issue of taxation of the digital marketplace. We have a lot of SMEs that are operating in that space, some degree of informality. Yeah. How do you begin investigating some of these questions? and questions that are not only challenging in a Kenyan context, but also globally. When you look at OECD and how they're trying to think about that topic, KRA would applaud them for beginning that conversation. As to why SMEs should engage, you know, there have been arguments that we pay taxes, but we don't really see the services. Maybe Gilbert can unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, we all have challenges. Every home has its own challenges. Yeah. So I'll flip the question and ask, what kind of deliberate conversations can the ecosystem have with government, the public sector? And there I want to applaud entities like KEPSA, the Kenya Manufacturers Association, the Chamber of Commerce, and an effort we at Strathmore also trying on agenda setting, where government meets with industry, meets with academia, and we have a very deliberate conversation on what needs to be done and have a very structured mechanism to implement those ideas.
I see.
Yes.
And if I could come to Eva before I get to Gilbert here. When you talk about this conversation around formality versus informality,
right.
I came from an environment where I was sitting on the sell side. So many times we'd be looking at SMEs and trying to even make them investable, starting
right.
from that point. How significant a challenge is this when it comes to enabling these particular businesses to actually tap into the capital that you sit on?
Yeah, it is quite a challenge, especially for the micro and SMS category, because maybe the mediums are a bit more structured. They've been in existence for some time. And the challenge is, for the most part, people start with the idea, and if it's in tech, you have an idea of a product that you want, you've identified the gap, and you run with it, and you create the most stellar product you can out there. But you are mostly in development phase, not really the business phase. So the formality from our perspective is trying to incorporate business to the development side. If it's in services, it's moving beyond providing the service to appreciate that you are more than the service you're delivering, and creating a framework of business that can appeal to capital providers, and not just venture capital or private equity, but also banks. They will look at your history and your KRA compliance and your ability to satisfy certain requirements in terms of repayments. Can they trust you in offering a credit facility? So formality in terms of structuring your business in a way that it's more stable and formal in creating those structures actually gives someone a competitive edge. It's in those instances that it's easier for an external capital provider to come in and say, okay, we can work with you, your books are in order, you don't have pending legal issues that may surprise us down the line with KRA. And because, for instance, private equity and venture capital, we are a partnership. We go into this for long-term periods, 5 to even 20 years in some instances. So how can I trust that getting into this partnership will not lead me in trouble with the regulator or the legal policy framework down the line? And that's where the formality comes to hand. Private equity also does due diligence, and so the shorter time you spend doing due diligence, if the books are in order, the easier it is for someone to access the capital.
I see. And Gilbert, coming to you, this conversation around cash flow and credit access is a key conversation around many of these kind of businesses.
Yes.
We'd just like to understand, what has your experience been, especially operating in the Kenyan landscape?
Well, that's a very good question. I just wanted to quickly bounce back on something he said, which is on that issue of young people saying that formalization of their ventures and businesses might not have a good return for them. I think to a large extent this is due to lack of awareness of what formalization actually brings in terms of benefits. It's a hugely beneficial thing to do, because it gives you access to the type of markets that you probably would not otherwise have access to, which in turn also gives you access to better revenues and make you more ambitious, because you can't be ambitious, you can't be growth minded if you're already limiting the ceiling of what you can do. If you are informal, there's only so far that you can go. There are some transactions you will never be able to have access to, if I'm not mistaken. So I think there is an element of awareness and education, and I was very excited when I saw that the new competency-based curriculum has that element of citizenship. I hope that maybe that element is there, not just citizenship in the sense of being a citizen, but also the broader context of what proper citizenship means, which means if you pay your taxes, for example, you not only have access to services from public authorities, but you have access to other advantages as well.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of having access to say, credit and functioning funds, I believe that most companies that are able to show a track record, as she was mentioning, will find some way of having access to some kind of financing. The first relationship you'll have from a financial point of view will probably be your bank. They can see your transactions, they can see how you operate. One of the things I've actually seen is, because of many companies might be informal, they don't record their financial transactions.
Sure.
So when they get to that time when they have a big purchase order or a big contract and they need to fund it, they don't have the history to back them up. That's why, again, I would go back to formalization, from the point of view that it can be a lifeline. It can help you to get to that next stage. For us in business, we've been privileged not to have challenges. We've always had very good relationships with our clients and so forth. But once in a while, we would ring up our bank and say, hey, we have this project we want to undertake. Would you be willing to have a discussion with us? And most of the time, they would look at our history and sit down and talk to us. Yeah. But you have to realize that there is work you have to do. It doesn't come automatically. One of the challenges I see is I'll be called by, say, a young person I know, and they say, I want to go into business. Can you give me $1 million shillings? And I'm thinking, I like you, but you know, this has to go beyond me liking you. You really have to kind of show me that, you know, this is not going to be a challenge for me. And you know, in these landscapes, many people have a challenge when they get into transactions that they haven't necessarily thought through. So I can understand where she's coming from, even though I wish, you know, we had more investors in the market that are looking at the early stage startups, because I think that's an opportunity missed.
But to be fair, Gilbert, and I'd like to know what Martin and Eva think about this. Sure. You talk about a track record, and many of the ventures we speak to will tell you our biggest client is the government. Now we know the issue of pending bills. Yeah. So if you're talking about a track record, and I go to my bank, and what should be a risk-free client is actually not servicing the payments that they should be meeting. What track record am I supposed to show? I mean, Martin, if I could get your thoughts around that, because we know the government is making effort towards settling these pending bills, but that has been a huge problem for SMEs.
Julian, that's a complicated question. And maybe I'll frame it to the point earlier that Gilbert had raised. This idea that there are election cycles, and in the context of Kenya, government is quite large. So we are talking of two levels, national and county. Yeah. I'm assuming quite a bit of those pending bills might be at the devolved level. Yeah, yes. with county governments. Let me frame the problem, I think, from a slightly larger perspective. A healthy ecosystem requires both the public sector and the private sector to work in harmony. What I like about Kenya is that we have a fairly large private sector. There are many other African countries you would move into and find the private sector has been largely constrained. With that means there's quite a bit of flexibility, you know, for companies to do as they please within the constraints of the rule of law. Specifically on the issue of government making available funds, I think there are many competing interests for those internal funds. So if KRA is not meeting its targets, then Treasury cannot release funds to be able to pay for services or products acquired from the private sector. So there's an argument, if we can collect more taxes, then we can deliver better services and we can pay for, I think, other issues that private sector has provided better. But there's also the question of ethics. Yeah. So there's quite a bit of leakage, I think, in the context of the public sector. If those loopholes can be sealed, and you know that's an entirely separate conversation, not necessarily today's conversation. But wanted to pick up some innovative ideas. Something like LPO financing. So if I've received an order as an SME, and I can take that document, a local purchase order, to a bank and tell them, I am certain I'm going to get these funds. Would you at least grant me some small amount, working capital, to be able to meet an immediate demand? And later, once everything has gone through, you can pay me the full amount. I wanted to highlight, I know one local bank, which within the last month or 2 months has explored how it can work with its supplier base to make LPO financing available within a very short period. And here we are talking hours as opposed to weeks. So what that does is it impacts the entire value chain and supply chain of that particular SME. For government, you've got the youth fund, you've got all these different funds, which ideally are supposed to ease working capital constraints for SMEs. Yeah. Some of the policy exists, but the implementation is not very good. What would be interesting is if part of this burden could be shifted to the private sector. And I know it's quite an interesting idea. Could the Venture Capital Association, working with global sources of funding and channeling these resources directly to private actors, enable LPO financing that shortens the window within which they can access funds for working capital needs? We take part of that burden away from government. If we address matters of corruption, matters of ethics, it means then we are making available significant resources that can make bills, pending bills, to your question, be paid. So I just wanted us to take a step back and view the problem within a larger ecosystem perspective. Yeah. And then maybe just for government itself, I think if we've got a more efficient revenue collection approach system and a much more efficient service delivery where citizens are feeling we are receiving value for what we are paying in taxes, we can actually solve matters significantly for the SME sector. And I notice government is also trying to do something to address matters of ethics, matters of corruption. I don't know what the other panelists think. I see. Yes. And Eva seems to be having a point here, and especially on what Martin just proposed in terms of the LPO financing. I know we have investment policy guidelines for many of these PE venture capitalists as well, but just share with us some thoughts.
All right. So in LPO financing, just because of the history, and I think my co-panelists have shared a bit of the context, history in Kenya and ability for the suppliers to pay here has been really negatively perceived, and so it's one of the highly risked, highly risky thought sources of funding for businesses. So, but having said that, rather than do direct investments to the entrepreneur, there are platforms that are coming to sort of act as the middle between the enterprise and the investors. So I'll give you an example. In 2018, EAVCA did a study on investing opportunities in fintech. So we were trying to appreciate Kenya is one of the leading tech hubs in Africa, and where are the investors likely to get the most reward investing in the fintech environment. And we found that on lending, so a fintech platform on lending to enterprise, was the leading opportunity for investors. So for us, where we would come in is probably working with the fintechs that then provide the cascaded capital to these businesses. But having said that, I will go back to a point that my co-panelist has mentioned, which is we have a lot of government funding for SMEs. We have a whole MSE authority that was set up in 2012 just to look at how to scale and accelerate investment opportunities into businesses. We have the Women Enterprise Fund, we have the Young People Fund, Alternatively Abled People's Fund, all those funds. I should say which in the current budget has collapsed all into one. Yeah, yes, so yes. I don't know the scale of uptake of these funds, but I feel that that should be the first level of interaction. For us as large-scale investors who have a longer-term horizon, we want some sort of security that someone has gone through the fundraising process and sourced some funding to at least be able to prove their concept. So in my opinion, that fund should be able to take the upfront risk. So if you ask me, government should actually be taking the upfront risk. They know these entrepreneurs better. It is in government's interest that these businesses succeed. Yeah. So take that upfront risk and then allow us and the bankers as well to come in as secondary or co-investors into these businesses that have proved their concept, probably beyond the threat period of 3.8 years. Yeah. So I once talked to a bank CEO who said, what misconception we have as enterprise is we often think of bank as the first result. It is not. because this is a credit facility that comes with terms of repayment, and so if we can broaden our thinking beyond banking, how else can we raise capital, right? And then that allows for a more innovative environment and even being able to better structure our businesses.
I see. And even there, you're essentially taking the tangent of government helping to essentially de-risk
Yes,
some of this investment.
exactly.
And oftentimes the feedback that we get based on that kind of point is that, fine, we have all these funds in place, but the capacity building among these particular businesses, and just to ensure that at least they are ready to absorb some of this capital, is lacking. I'd like to know some of your thoughts around this, Gilbert, in terms of the degree to which ventures in this particular category are capacitated to be able to tap into some of these resources that exist.
That's an excellent question, because sometimes I get concerned when we think that throwing money at a business is a guarantee for success. I think that's very far from the truth. The reality is there are very, very specific skills. Being successful in business is both a science and an art. You do need, there's some hard pieces of knowledge that you have to be able to acquire, whether you are single in that particular business or whether you have partners. So I'll just give you an example. People often talk about leadership. It's a word that you will hear left, right, and center. But in the context, for example, of a small company, what does that mean? It means you have, if you are a founder, for example, and you've come up with a business, you have to be able to, number one, be able to build a team. You have to be able to get that team to a skills level that allows you to serve the clients that you want to serve. And then you have to be able to yourself be strong enough as a leader to pull this team towards a vision. And you have to be able to counsel them, support them, and all that. So just that talent element is a huge thing that requires specific tooling, specific training. Then you talk about what we are just alluding to, taxation, for example. That's an entirely complicated area. I have to admit that over the last few years since we've been in business, we have seen that Kenya, and I compare with other countries, Kenya has really made serious leaps forward in terms of making it easy for us to be compliant. But it's still a technical process. It's still something that you need either knowledge for if you can't afford, say, an accountant or a financial service provider. So there is an entire ecosystem of things that you need, not just to survive as a startup, but to scale. And I think that many of these venture capital firms are by and large trying to find whether you actually have the skill sets they need to get a return on investment. Sometimes the idea is fantastic, sometimes the ecosystem is fantastic, but they just don't see the capacity in-house. So in terms of training, I would say that it needs to start very early, because the first thing is the mindset. And that's why, again, coming back to my earlier point, that the competency-based curriculum being proposed for me looks like a good approach. It's too early to say whether it's working or not. But I think the earlier you start, training people on the importance of creativity, showing them how to learn, because it's not enough to get the content. It's important to learn how to learn. And that's one of the core competencies. So I would say that that's one approach that I think is going to do a lot of good to the ecosystem. And then there is a lot being done by the likes of Strathmore. I don't know whether some of the venture capital investors are doing the same, but it's really a heavy lift and I can't really see one size fits all. It's everyone who has to try to lift these entrepreneurial ecosystem up in terms of those skills.
I see. And Martin, just get to you. This issue of capacity building, I'd imagine Strathmore is definitely right at the center of this. What's your assessment of the situation as it exists, and perhaps what are you guys doing around this?
Let me start with the latter question. So as soon as this Friday, we have a session on family businesses. And that it's an open day, so we get families which largely represent the demographic that are SMEs coming to the university, essentially spending half a day just getting exposed to some of the ideas that can help their businesses grow. If I move a month earlier, the conference we held, where thematically we try to focus on how SMEs can plug into this broader vision of the country. and also connected to the Continental Free Trade Area, where Kenya was among the earliest signatories, the first or the second, depending on whether you ask Ghana or Kenya, and among the first to ratify in their legislature. Really for SMEs, these are buzzwords: Continental Free Trade Area, East African Community.
I mean, the big four.
It is a big four. They don't really understand. So in addition to a class like what we have, or an open day like what we have on Friday, and the conference, we've used those opportunities to bring in key actors. Within this most recent conference, we had somebody from the African Development Bank, where part of the conversation was unpacking if a business wants to do to excel in a market like Ghana, where do they start, what do they do? Prior to them even being exposed to such opportunities, we try and make sure that the issues that were being raised, can they maintain their accounts? Can they understand issues around marketing, the leadership, the very basic things? We've got quite a number of offerings internally. And I know our peer institutions, universities do. In the TVET system, the technical vocational, I know some of those ideas have also been cascaded into such institutions. I also wanted to pick the idea of partnerships. So Strathmore at least has had conversations with organizations like KEPSA, the Chamber of Commerce, the Association of Manufacturers, who typically have access to the network, but may not necessarily have the capacity. So when they partner with universities and institutions like this, that capacity is built. At a global level, UNCTAD, which is concerned with matters trade globally, Strathmore was invited last year, December, to be among the partners in the very first Africa e-commerce week, where quite a number of entrepreneurs, SMEs were engaged. And over the following 12 months since we had that particular event, Strathmore has been trying to explore at a global level, how do we get our SMEs to be competitive globally? One of the partnerships we have through UNCTAD is through the International Trade Center. WTO and the World Trade Organization and UNCTAD are essentially among the founding entities for the ITC. At Strathmore, we've been working with about 10, 15 entrepreneurs and equipping them to meet global standards associated with climate and associated with issues of sustainability, the SDGs. And the idea is that after a period of taking these courses in partnership with these global organizations, they can sell to global markets. So they automatically meet standards by the time they show up there. We've got, across the university, we've got our law school, where we have quite a bit of expertise around how to navigate legal issues. As much as possible, in my own department, where we partner with government, so we have courses on public policy, sustainability, we always try to bring this idea of SMEs to the core and to the front. But I wanted to connect that to the panel, to your initial question. How do you give access to capacity building? What will be interesting is at a national level, if both private and public sector could partner. And earlier this year at Radisson Blu, there was this whole new concept of creating shared value, where you had this notion that companies, as they seek to make profit, can also use that capacity to solve social problems. And it's quite a powerful framework. Mark Kramer, Michael Porter introduced it in the context of SMEs. And I know quite a number of our larger banks and institutions like Safaricom have signed up for that. It will be interesting to build capacity building, maybe frameworks that can be cascaded all the way down to the counties. But once those skills are acquired, then immediately the Safaricoms, the KCBs, the ABSAs, all these big financial institutions could literally work with SMEs within their networks for conversations and agenda that have been set at a national, continental, global level by captains of industries, presidents, governors, for those who are operating at that granular level. So it's a very different way of thinking about capacity building. So that if it's effectively what we are doing is for the whole ecosystem, we are increasing we are basically raising the tide. And through different ways, people know where to latch.
Okay. Just before I get to Eva, I think you have a quick ride on that point.
Sure. Yes, I just wanted to add that the Shared Value Initiative is a fantastic initiative. And I think from the point of view of an entrepreneur, I would want it to even come a notch further down and include the larger ecosystem of SMEs. having been in business for the last 9 years as a strategic communications and consulting company, we've amassed a lot of knowledge. And recently we decided to actually start transferring that knowledge to younger people in communities. So every quarter we take on about 5 young people, specifically from Kibera, and we take them through some training in areas where we are particularly strong. And I think that if this could be adopted by other companies, small, big, and so forth, we could actually start seeing some kind of ripple effect, because initiatives are great to set leadership, but some of the large-scale changes are going to have to come from companies themselves, small, large, going out to do things and to impart the knowledge, because we don't have to wait for someone else to do it. Yeah. If I have knowledge that I can transfer, I should just find a way to format it, put a structure to it, and get the people I need to give that information to, and then just go ahead and do it. That's how true entrepreneurs do it anyway.
I see. Yeah. And even this subject of capacity building and perhaps what EAVCA could be doing on this front.
Yeah. All right. Oh, okay. So we've done a few initiatives. First of all, for us, it was to try and build an ecosystem of businesses that institutional investors at different stages could come in and take up. Our role as EAVCA, beyond representing private capital in the region, is also to showcase the opportunities available for these investments to be deployed into. And so maybe the more mature business investors may have an inclination of where to go, but for venture capital, we realized about 2 years ago there was a bit of a fragmentation in the M&S enterprises which they would ideally target. And so one of the things that we did is get together with the accelerators and incubation hubs. We have quite a number in Nairobi Garage, iHub, and there's one at Strathmore.
Yeah, iLab. So
iLab.
Yes,
yes. So working with them to first find out what enterprises are coming through the systems and what challenges are they facing. A lot of the times, the capacity along business strategy, legal guidance, tax and accounting guidance is often flagged, and so we try to match our networks. We do have quite the extensive membership that is based of advisors, and ask them to volunteer some of their services to this up and coming businesses. So essentially either at a discounted or even pro bono basis. And we have worked with a few of these incubation acceleration centers to introduce some of our members to sort of give pro bono services to them. So that's one. And then the second one is we have quite a vast network, or from our vantage point, we interact quite a bit with development finance institutions, the likes of World Bank, CDC from the UK, and even the American ones. Canada has FinDev Canada, and so try to introduce to them the concept of funding enterprise. I know FinDev Canada in July launched 2X Impact, which is targeted at funding M&S enterprises for women, and they have about $50 million to deploy specifically to that category, and they've been running an acceleration competition, I believe, since July, probably to close in December, where they're trying to bring into their fold of mentorship and funding up-and-coming businesses led by women or targeting women consumers that they can then provide their services to. So working with DFIs to showcase these opportunities. We also have foundations and impact investors that also give technical assistant grants, and it's trying to connect them with the opportunities available in that space. So technical assistance is probably not direct cash, but money that would enable an up-and-coming business to access services that they may otherwise find expensive, like tax consulting. So the technical funding then comes in to bridge that and catalyze the sustainability or formalization of the business. So it's at different levels, and I guess as other business membership organizations, we see ourselves as building the entire ecosystem. Our point is, if we can be able to get an M&S enterprise to get capital, then that then leads into the value chain of future VC funding. So we start with seed funding, then we go into VC, and then we go into PE, and then maybe we list the business. And that's where EAVCA sees its role.
My colleague Janet Nyamwamu in Kisii with some thoughts around this particular discussion. Janet.
Well, I'm here in Kisii County. Considering the high number of SMEs in Kisii, I'm here with one of the businessmen with an SME who is going to tell us about what the challenges that they have in the SME business and the possible solutions to the challenges.
Well, my name is Walter Nyakundi. I'm a small business retailer here in Kisii. Concerning the SMEs, I want to say that the government, looking at the business structure in Kisii, the business is tremendously growing very well. But also there is a major concern concerning the business rates, because if the business rates go very high, it really affects the business community. And also I may comment about we have issue concerning the Big Four agenda. When we talk about the Big Four agenda, we have the enablers of this Big Four agenda, as the President put. So I want to talk about roads, and as well as the rates, as well as water. These are the major enablers for the economy. Now, when we don't have roads, for instance, around, it really affects our business. So what I want to say is that if the government wants to really invest in SMEs, and the SMEs are the great economy makers in any economy. So for instance, here in Kisii, if we find rates going up now and again, it really affects the traders around. Let's say Mama Mboga, the Juakali sector, and any other small business around. So I could say, Janet, let the government really take concern of this, because the heroes and heroines we have in this economy are the small traders, the Juakali people, and all these people that we have in this economy. So if we can get better roads, because these people want to penetrate, to do business. If I want to do business, I want a better road. I want fair rates in electricity, because we really sympathize with the economy when we find that the rates are going up and again and again. It really affects us. So I can also say, if we also want to make this better, let the government have a stable political stability. What do I mean? Political stability enables governance to take place. If there is good governance in an economy, then we have political stability. The business is stable. All these are factors that attribute to great SMEs improvement. And I can also add on, we have credit facility access. Most of these small SMEs like us, when we go to banks, we have major challenges, like attachment, let's say, of collateral. If you're a small business person, you don't have a title deed, you don't have a logbook, you are unable to access a credit facility, or it becomes a challenge. So my major concern is the banks should also come with fair modalities on business people. It will enable us to go for credit facilities other than going for Shylocks and such situations.
Thank you, Walter. You've heard one of the SME businessmen in Kisii. Their challenges are roads and the credit facilities from banks. From Kisii County, I'm Janet Nyamwamu.
And many thanks, Janet, for that link and what Walter has just shared with us in terms of the challenges that they're facing as small and medium businesses in Kisii County. If I could just get some immediate reactions from the panel in light of what Walter has highlighted there. A number of those issues at a macro level in terms of road infrastructure, in terms of access to water and electricity tariffs. But really just to get your quick thoughts, if I could start with you, Martin, around what Walter was saying.
Sure. I wanted to first compliment Walter Nyakundi. He actually brought a Big Four agenda and mentioned the enablers and narrowed down to a very particular set of enablers. He mentioned roads, he brought up water also, but he was also talking about rates. Maybe a quick reaction to that is policy coherence. So some of the issues he's raising are at the devolved level, because roads, there are some that are the purview of national government, others are purview of county governments. How can we get a more deliberate conversation going on at these two levels of government and issues of tracking, monitoring and evaluation. Could we have a big matrix that looks across the road, and SMEs using digital means can actually send a complaint immediately to a switchboard, government switchboard somewhere, just to use a high-level analogy. But at a more fundamental level, I was intrigued as he was speaking. I could see quite a bit of activity behind him. A lady walked by carrying a big container of fruits. There were quite a number of motorbikes moving back and forth, which for me signals that the economy is thriving, is doing well. But specifically on one issue he raised, which has resonated quite a bit and it features in the Bureau of Statistics report, is this issue of licensing.
Yeah.
So right now you've got multiple entities for which an SME gets licenses, something associated with ability to do business, something associated with local government, something associated with health and sanitation. It would be ideal if all this could be narrowed down to a single document, one or two documents. And then a second reaction to what he raised about credit, matters of credit facilities. It came up in our conference, and actually quite strongly. We had one particular panel where one of the top 3 banks was seated, and an SME was complaining, we've done all things, we've met all these thresholds, but it's still very difficult to access cash, working capital, when we need it. Yeah. For that, I wanted to highlight this idea of value chains and clusters. Earlier, we had talked of creating shared value. Value chains are really this idea that when you know the consumption, the end product, the end service, who is going to consume it, and then you work your way backwards. So you've got traders, you've got processors or manufacturers or service entities, and at the very beginning you have producers. In Kisii, I would think bananas. In Mwea, I would think rice. Different parts of the country, I'd think of particular products. It will be nice to have a clear mapping of value chains for the high priority products or services that for which Kenya can be competitive. Yeah. On the basis of that mapping, looking at specific clusters, so each of those counties or towns I mentioned represents a cluster, it will be nice to understand what's going on. So we've heard from Kisii. If today we had a similar perspective from Mombasa, Marsabit, etc., it will be nice to understand what's going on locally. When you bring those two worlds together, value chains and clusters, then it becomes very easy to figure out what are the policy constraints along the value chain or within the cluster, and who is responsible for it. Is it national government or is it devolved government? And if neither national nor devolved government can handle, can the private sector pick up some of the slack to address what I would deem a social problem? Quite a bit of what Gilbert was alluding to.
And I'll be coming back on that issue of the coherence between national and county governments. But Eva, just to get your initial thoughts.
Yeah, first of all, Walter said SMEs are the real heroes indeed. Having celebrated Mashujaa Day, I will 100% agree with that. They are the reason we have a near 24-hour economy. Marikiti is 24 hours, and so for that, we salute you. And we appreciate everything they're doing. Back to another point Walter talked about, which is creating the infrastructure. He talked about roads, electricity, water. For me, that's the entire infrastructure, including things like internet and technology advancement. From our perspective, one of the reasons Kenya is a leading VC, venture capital destination in Africa is because of our technology and the ability to transact on mobile platforms, the new ideas that are consistently coming to even serve traditional businesses like banking and energy. We now have M-Copper in them. One of the reasons we have excelled at that is because we have a rather friendly and advanced infrastructure around tech. And so it's for our policymakers to recognize that the little they do in facilitating and enabling the creation of this infrastructure has a very long-term effect on appealing to and attracting capital that is international. For venture capital and private equity, ours is competitive capital. Nothing stops someone from taking the same amount they're investing in a business here into Ethiopia or into Uganda. So it is for our policymakers to appreciate that we want to retain that top level or that top position as a destination and work with private sector, not necessarily us as capital investors, but also people who are strategic investors, manufacturers, multinational corporations, to keep them here so that they employ our people, so that they transfer some of their expertise into the local market, and slowly we can start building long-term businesses. I would only imagine if, and we're seeing some of this, Google engineers or people who are Kenyans, ex-Google, now setting up their local information technology businesses and thriving out of that. So creating that sort of ecosystem is really important. And then Walter has also mentioned credit access. So people assume that in the absence of bank credit, they can default to talking to private equity and venture capital. One of the things that that may not work for is private equity and venture capital is long-term funding. We're looking at it at 3 years to 7 years at the very minimum. There's other projects that take more than that. So that's not meant to fund working capital, or rather it stops making sense when you're addressing short-term needs. That's money that's meant to go into strategic or visionary investment, right? So we, in as much as we are part of the international institutional capital framework, would not be effective without the right infrastructure for credit lending in the domestic market. And we obviously need each other. And so it's acknowledging that any hindrances to credit deployment in the market also has an impact on long-term funding of the businesses here.
And many VC and venture capital and private equity players will always tell us that one of the challenges they have in terms of putting capital is identifying exit opportunities. I think that's a conversation for another day.
Sure.
Gilbert, just to get your thoughts on what Walter was saying there.
Yes, I found his intervention very compelling. It's actually very compelling, very insightful. And I want to pick up on something that Martin said in regards to what Walter was intimating. Value chains and clusters, mapping them. And I would want to even go a bit deeper. Over the years, as we've worked for different businesses, helping them to scale, helping them to expand their operations in various countries and various markets, not just various countries, but even within the same country. One of the things we have noticed is that there is a life cycle to the success and eventual growth of a company. So if you look from the destination point of view, for a company to grow, there has to be a set of collaborations and relationships that growth has to be based on. When you have a customer, that's a relationship. When you have a supplier who gives you a good price, that's a relationship. When you have someone who gives you credit, that's a relationship. And one of the critical things we have actually realized is that for that relationship to be cemented, one of the core elements is trust. So the person giving you credit or money has to trust that you will give them back that investment they've put in you. The person who is supplying to you goods has to trust that you will pay them. You have to trust that what they've given you is of good quality for you to sell it onwards. And we've realized that ecosystems and companies and traders, whether they're small, medium, or otherwise, that are able to map very well their ecosystems and their partners and their stakeholders, and who are able to build solid relationships at whatever level, they're the ones that end up going very far. And now if you now come a notch back and ask yourself, what does it take to build trust? Essentially, one of the things we've realized is when people understand you. So if I understand that your business has the capacity to pay me, I will be able to give you some level of trust. And if we build a relationship and you do pay me, I will trust you even more. So how do these companies get, or how do these small traders get to articulate themselves so that they are better understood by those who give credit? And that's where we see perhaps organizations such as government entities at both national and devolved levels coming in to help create ecosystems that allow different stakeholders to meet and understand each other and create marketplaces. So being understood is very critical to build trust. And even before you get to being understood, you have to have a clear identity. So the starting point for me, therefore, becomes every trader, every small-scale entrepreneur who aspires to grow, they have to actually be able to articulate what it is that they do, what it is that they want to achieve.
Yeah.
Because then they get understood, trusted, and they get to collaborate with the right people. And I believe that, as he correctly put it, private sector players can play a role, and I can see a role here for even the capital providers or venture capital stakeholders such as the ones Eva has mentioned. We all can play a role, but it has to be deliberate. I think the challenge is that so far, none of this has been deliberate. It's like we all sort of stumble into things.
Yeah.
And I think what he's asking for, what Walter is asking for, is for everyone in this ecosystem to be deliberate. We want the government to be deliberate in their support. It doesn't have to be financial support, but it can be ecosystem support. We want those who provide credit to be deliberate. Do they really want us as their clients? If they are, then let them come, tell us, this is the ecosystem I want, for me to trust you, this is what I need for you, and then I'll go back and try to bring this to you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I see. Martin, I want to get back to the conversation around devolved governments, national governments, and the synergies between these two. Earlier this year, beginning late last year into early this year, we saw an incident where one very huge savings and cooperatives collapsed. And one of the net effects was that there was a bit of uncertainty as to who should be responsible in terms of regulatory oversight. Because if you read the Constitution, then cooperatives are a devolved function. But ever since 2010, there has been no legislation passed to actually ensure that this is cascaded now to the devolved county level. Now, this had a major impact on small businesses because they go there, they make their deposits to take credit. But when such an entity collapses and there is uncertainty, then it compounds the problem that they face in terms of access to credit. When you look at the regulatory framework, giving it a broad view, what are some of your thoughts around how this can be streamlined?
Thank you, Julian. I think you may be referring to the Keza Sacco debacle, I think a few months earlier this year. I'd read a bit about it. And your question is specifically on policy coherence at two levels of government. I think the Constitution, first of all, I'll applaud that document. Globally, it started as a very powerful document. And then at the same time, I'll pour some water, on it. The arguments that it's a very expensive, or what was envisioned was quite an expensive form of government. We've got representation down to the lowest level, but the resources required to maintain what the Constitution envisions makes it quite difficult to implement. And I think some of that trade-off is what we are witnessing. So there are specific functions that are for national government, and there are others that are for devolved government, either the executive where you have the governors, or the other legislative in the context of the legislature at the devolved level where you have the MCAs, at the national level, Senate and National Assembly. Maybe a way of providing coherence around that, and it's one of the things at Strathmore we've been exploring. My colleague Dr. Kibua, who used to work at the Central Bank and spent quite a bit of time as an economist, also taught at University of Nairobi, has been working closely with the accounting fraternity, just to give an example, to look at policies around income tax. And there's a document they've put together back in 2017, and it had 5 policy recommendations. And it was a very structured way of looking at the Income Tax Act. Over the years, there have been many amendments, but there's never been a holistic view to understand in this new economy where the definitions have changed. Is there a very structured way of thinking about how you should interact with the citizen? If we pick that example from the financial sector, the same could be done in lending, the same could be done in deposits, the same could be done in various aspects of finance. The same could also be moved to other sectors, agriculture. And I just want to pick a recent example on the rice, which is a staple food. Within the past, on August 28th, there was a gathering at Strathmore. It was an effort of national government through the presidency. The Ministry of Trade was represented, Ministry of Agriculture. And we had 3 counties, actually, Taita Taveta, Kisumu, and Kirinyaga. And it was a very structured conversation to try and understand if there was a coherent set of policies for the rice value chain in ways that make Kenya competitive. We import quite a bit from Pakistan. Could we be producing sufficient domestically to meet demand, and then we export paddy, which is unprocessed rice, into Uganda, Tanzania, where value is added and the same rice is exported to other markets. So rather than bans, introducing tariffs, could we make our rice so competitive that we're essentially exporting it across Africa in the context of the free trade area? And the one word I would like to introduce is this notion of competitiveness. As we go back and look at all the existing policies and how they speak to each other, could we try and understand how harmonization of all of them could make Kenya more competitive? Yeah. And this is quite an easy framework then, if whether you're talking national or devolved, whether you're talking judiciary, executive, or legislature, that can happen. I just wanted to close off on this particular issue by applauding the private sector. KEPSA, CAM, which I think came up early in the conversation, and the Chamber of Commerce, which have been very deliberate in picking this issue of SMEs and figuring out how through the structured roundtables. KEPSA has quite a number with all the arms of government. I think earlier this week they were in Mombasa meeting with KRA as part of the executive. We should have more of those agenda setting structured conversations, and in those conversations be very deliberate in how we're introducing topics for SMEs. And then my own executive dean at Strathmore, Dr. Njenga, I think along with our Vice Chancellor designate, hosted the presidency at Strathmore to engage directly with SMEs. Conversations are still going on in the context of value chain and clusters, but really it's those kinds of mechanisms. If we can be very deliberate in how we grow them, then we can achieve the kind of harmony we desire. It'll take a while, but and we can learn even from the Rwandan example, their national dialogues and their summit.
Gilbert, I want to get your thoughts around, as a person operating this sort of a business, have you felt impacted, whether adversely or positively, with the kind of policy framework we have, especially this coordination between national and county governments? Because many times we'll be told that here you are, as a business, you've complied with all the requirements, but then the county government now comes slapping with a number of levies, because of course on their side they have to raise on-source revenue. So there are those kind of nuances into this.
I would say that to some extent, any entrepreneur who is operating in this particular landscape is trying to grapple with how to manage both levels. So as a business, for example, you will wonder, what license do I get from which office? Because the county government will tell you this is what I need from you, and the national government will tell you this is what I need from you. I wouldn't say that it has been a massive challenge, but I would say that it has been a learning curve, because you have to go through a certain process whereby you're figuring out what goes where. And then once you get to figure it out, I think it becomes much easier. Some companies will probably find it easier than others, depending on the sector and the business they're in. For the business that we're in, we haven't really, or the businesses that I happen to be involved in, we haven't encountered major differences, but we did have to bring on board experts that we have to spend a handsome premium on to be able to help us figure it out. And I guess that's not a luxury that perhaps other smaller entities might have. That's not even a luxury that all of us should have, really, because none of us really wants to see our expenditure go up. But it is a timely thing. It's something that you go through at time. And I think once you get out on the other line, you feel stronger and more confident.
I see. Eva, your thoughts on this policy coordination?
I 100% agree that there's need for dialogue between national and county level policies or rather policymakers, and creating some sort of cohesive framework. Gilbert may not be affected, but I know people who are affected by something as trivial as advertising license. So Nation Media Group, County of Nairobi focused, and then you move to Embu or another county, not necessarily that one, but change from your home county to another, attract an advertising levy. What? Why? So I think that those are some of the things that we need to address, and from our perspective, because we are not necessarily, as investors, operational or active in the day-to-day business. So we will come in at a strategic point. So at the top level, put capital and provide some strategic corporate guidance in terms of strategy, our development or market development. So these are some of the things that sometimes come up when you're doing due diligence, and then you stop and ask yourself, is this business as attractive if we have to spend so much money doing multiple levels of filings in terms of licensing? And so it's a cost that the entrepreneur unfairly bears.
Yeah.
And so I think if all of us, and I think there's a consensus at county level, at national level, that we want to attract the best businesses, we want to retain our investors in our counties and in the nation. I think that is well agreed. So it's just about finding what's the best way that we can go about this, well, obviously providing a win for the county and its ability to generate revenues, and at national level to keep the ease of doing business and the attractiveness of the country.
I see. I want to switch gears and talk about something around the demographics that were highlighted in this KNBS report. And Martin, if I could start with you. The report by KNBS indicates that 54.9% of the businesses that were closed, these are the businesses that were closed in that 4-year period,
yes,
in the study, were owned by female sole proprietors, and only 45.1% were owned by male.
Yes.
This definitely brings to the table the discussion around some of the challenges perhaps that might be unique to ladies running these businesses versus those that are unique to men. Yes. Some of your thoughts around this, Martin.
Yes. So looking at the report, in the initial pages, it gives a breakdown of the areas they touched on. They looked at employment, size distribution. The very third point was distribution of MSMEs by sex of owners, so essentially gender, which I think is the question you're speaking to. And specifically, you're asking about failure rates. From reading that statement, one could conclude that women-owned businesses have a higher disposition towards failure, but that will be misreading that particular data point. And there are aspects of that can be unpacked. Of the data that was collected, the businesses that were registered, is it possible that those businesses are actually female-owned but male-run? And then of the businesses that were successful, is it possible that they are male-registered but female-run? And I think it's, I just want to pick our recent conference and some of the interactions at Strathmore we've had with SMEs. It's interesting who shows up for these events. At times you'll have a 20-year-old lady, very well-studied, very well-spoken, and is the person who's actually running the business. But when you ask them to take part, say, in a competition or register for one of these many things that formalization requires, they're unable to. Why? Because the business is registered under the father, who has educated the daughters and made sure they've had access to all kinds of opportunities. So it goes to the very question of how do we understand the registration of this business? Should there be more nuanced ways, particularly as we are thinking of, actually not only women, I would say women, youth, and those who have disabilities of one kind or another. Is there a very deliberate effort to understand their needs and challenges, and to equip them to be able to succeed? So for a demographic like that, where I think it was 54%, I would say probably what we are seeing is an instance of not as much support is being given to that particular demographic. And secondly, not as much data is being collected to inform the funders, to inform various actors what more can be done. So looking at that statistic, I would want to situate it. And I'll be curious to hear what both Gilbert and Eva have to say with this. But also just one final thought. If I look at the rice value chain, when we had the forum, there was an interesting statistic. By and large, women are in the farm, cultivating the rice, making sure the produce has been received that initial set of processing, and they turn it on to traders, typically middlemen, who then proceed to sell it in different markets, including Nairobi. Guess who is the last to be paid? It's the woman in the farm. It can take up to a whole year. Yet that's the person on whom, and I like the phrase that was used, the entire weight of the industry is sitting on her shoulders. So that can begin unpacking some of the complex challenges at play. But I'm curious to hear.
Eva, definitely, there are quite some interesting nuances from Martin there. Just to get your thoughts around this subject.
First of all, I appreciate that he acknowledged some of the success credit went to men when it was really deserved to women. So thank you for that. But really, I do agree with some of the sentiments he shared. I have seen even in households where there's a husband and wife, the husband will have the ownership or registered the name under themselves, yet it's the woman who runs it. Maybe he has a day job, and then this is the family business, and then the woman is the caretaker of it. So the success of that goes to the wrong person. But beyond that, I think as a society, until very recently in this century, we just couldn't give women opportunities. We talk about the girl child, but really, it's because for the longest time there were no opportunities for them to grow, get mentorship, and obviously that has an impact on business. Just looking at how recent it is that women could get loans from banks, I think it's a 1990s item. So as less as maybe 29 years back, women could still not access credit facilities from commercial lenders, and that has an impact on the success stories of the business, or even being able to get mature mentors who can guide you through the next phase as a young and up-and-coming woman. And we see it even in the investing space. There's a lot more focus right now on gender lens investing, where we are as an industry being more deliberate in identifying women-led businesses or businesses that have women as the end consumer, and trying to bring them up in the hope that they, one, create the next level of mentors for the up-and-coming entrepreneurs, but two, it also empowers the society. And so we have a few funds that are doing gender lens investing as an approach to try and tackle that and ensure that we see more success in women-led businesses. And finally, I think as a business membership organization, we do acknowledge that there is some challenge in terms of bridging the gap between men and women in business. And I think in that regard, I've seen quite a bit being done by even other business membership organizations. I think there's women in business forums in at least each and every membership organization that I have interacted with. So that's something that we can applaud, that ourselves as private sector are taking notice and trying to change the narrative.
I see. Before I get to Gilbert, I want to stick with you because there's some feedback here coming on social media from a lady, and specifically to you. Venture capitalists have been accused of taking over people's businesses in the guise of helping. They start at 5% and then keep on twisting the business owners to cede more and more of their business. I'd imagine that this is, of course, you bring in equity and you take a stake, and progressively you're increasing the stake. If you could just clear the air around this particular matter, what normally happens?
Certainly, and it's part of the reason why I'm here, to help clarify on that. First of all, venture capital, private equity does not take over. We are there to invest on a short period. I think the average in Africa is 5.6 years, so about 5 years, and then we exit. At the very minimum, cross-cutting item across venture capital and private equity all over the world is that at some point we will exit. And so we see ourselves as partners to the entrepreneur, to the business owner, including families. We're not there for the long time. We're here to help you get to the next level of growth and strategy so that we can exit. Having said that, this is where awareness comes to hand. Businesses, family business owners, entrepreneurs being equipped with the knowledge to know that this is a partnership where one might have more resources in terms of funding, and so you need to be aware of your contribution to this partnership and being able to put your voice forward. And obviously you will be a shareholder sometimes, or at least for Kenya or East Africa, most of our investors are minority shareholders, so the family and the entrepreneur is left to hold the controlling stake. So you still have a voice at it, and because of that you have quite the voice. It's just that I think we tend to look heavily to what the narrative is from the West. But for East Africa, most of us are growth capital investors, which means we don't do buyout or leveraged buyout or takeover funding, because for the most part, the entire continent is really small, and will invest in significantly small businesses, and you don't want to take over that kind of business because you're, one, not an expert, and two, there's just insurmountable risks that you may not be able to see. So what we can appreciate for East Africa at least is our investors, our growth investors, which means for the most part they'll take minority shareholding, and well, there's a few people who do majority, but we are still not going to do takeovers here. And then the second one is that even as an entrepreneur, you have a say, and part of the reason I'm here and what we do as EAVCA, putting our name out there, is to sensitize enterprise, family business owners that they have the legal right to seek recourse and to empower themselves to invest alongside PE.
And definitely we'll be seeking to invite you for a different discussion on deal structuring, so that at least that is laid on the table much clearer. Gilbert, to get your thoughts around the issue of the demographics, Martin definitely brought in some good nuances, which have been shared as well by Eva, in terms of women, men ownership versus who runs the business.
Yes.
Your thoughts?
Interestingly, global statistics show that Africa is the only region in the world where more women than men choose to go into entrepreneurship. So by and large, there are more women in business in Africa than men. So perhaps the question is, at what level do we have this concentration of women? Perhaps we might look at the informal sector being the biggest one. But then that also leads us to ask us deeper questions.
Yeah.
What would be a reason to lead more women not to succeed in business? Obviously, men and women do encounter challenges, but studies again have indicated that women specifically have challenges when it comes to, for example, asset registration. So if you're a woman having, when you have, say, a husband and you have a piece of land and you have some small kibanda or a small business somewhere, and at some point you want to raise capital. You go to a microfinance institution, they tell you, give us collateral. You go back home, you ask to get the title deed, you are denied that title deed. And what happens? You can't continue with that particular venture. You might even shut down your ambitions. So that is actually a big challenge that has been looked at in many countries. And some countries have found a solution by coming up with policies and laws that enforce joint registration of collateral, of property, matrimonial property. Countries like Rwanda, countries like Ethiopia have been working on that. I'm not very certain about the case in Kenya, but I would assume that there are some directions towards that. So that's just a case in point of some of the challenges that female-owned businesses might encounter. There is also another observation I have had. Many women tend to go into traditionally female businesses and industries, as opposed to venturing into male-dominated or male-categorized businesses. And I think there also there is a challenge.
When you talk about female-dominated, just give us examples, perhaps.
So let's look at, for example, cab-hailing taxi drivers. How many women do you often encounter in that field? That's just one of them. Sometimes you'll see a story somewhere, or you hear people talking about, oh, that lady is a mechanic, she's tough. Why does she have to be tough? Because she's a mechanic. It's an intellectual field. Any woman can go into it and do it. But because of the way we are socialized, not every woman will feel free to just venture into a profession that is categorized as male or viewed as male. So in that sense, I would say that it could have something to do with the lack of mentorship by women in those sectors. There aren't many enough. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. But I would also say that perhaps if our societies would also start breaking down some of these things, it I believe could open up more opportunities for women to grow into the sectors they choose to go into, and also perhaps choose to go into more fields than the ones they find themselves into. So those are some of the perspectives I would have on that particular point.
I see, and Martin seems to be wanting to add something there.
Yes, I just wanted to pick on a point he raised and connect it back to one of our opening ideas, is this idea of formalization. the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which is essentially a UN framework where 200 plus countries globally signed on back in 2015 September, among the measures includes this question of diversity, and specifically how many youth-owned or women-owned businesses are thriving. It was just to pick that as an example. So a very practical and easy way of making that happen is if the large corporates, for example, relooked the entire supply chain, and I applaud companies like Safaricom, the late Bob Collymore, God rest his soul in peace. Bob Collymore was very deliberate. Safaricom today, if you look at the leadership ranks, if you look at the supplier network, there was a very deliberate effort to quantify how many of these businesses meet this particular threshold with respect to demographics. And it gives a very powerful example of how you can integrate some of the SMEs, kinds of SMEs that have failed. Yeah. By the 3 or 4 year mark, they should be at a point where, upon formalization, automatically they qualify to work with a company like Safaricom, which as it's going continental or global, carries such companies along with them. And so the challenge I'll give, going back to the creating shared value model, if we were to frame that particular statistic as a social problem, and we were to ask our corporates to embrace at least one of the sustainable development goals that can address that social problem, and without compromising their business model and their profitability goals so that they're still attractive to EVA, you can actually have specific clusters where those companies exist, uplifting an entire demographic that is currently excluded. And if you read the sustainability report of companies like Safaricom, KCB have done this quite well, you can actually capture that. And I'll give just a second example. I was with one of the banks in one of their conversations. They were engaging their suppliers, and there's a specific entity, Tunaweza Women. Yeah. This is a woman-owned, and the lead order is also has a physical disability. I didn't know it today, but there's a small bracelet I bought for about 500 shillings when they were being hosted. I think it was at the Radisson Blu. She has been banking with this institution for quite a number of years, and I don't think she has ever taken a loan. That was what emerged in that conversation. But what was very powerful was that by her being given an audience in a panel like this to engage directly with the top leaders of the institution and to sell her wares, we were supporting an entire ecosystem somewhere in the coast. Yeah. And within her company, it's primarily women who have disabilities, but also men. So if we can reimagine, particularly the big corporates, how to pull along all the SMEs in ways that speak to national, regional, continental priorities, then a lot of the I think industries that Gilbert was alluding to that have a particular domination in terms of gender, we can begin reimagining in actually a quantifiable period of time, 2 years, 24 months. Here's how we've moved forward. And then an interesting idea, what if KRA gave a tax benefit to corporates that could demonstrate they have carried along others? So they're not doing it alone, but if they can tick SDG, this and that and this and that, they've carried everybody along.
I'm sure if I had KRA on this panel, they would say they don't have the fiscal space because we understand the kind of environment we are in. But quickly getting to the tail end of our conversation, one of the other points which was highlighted by the KNBS report is that 70% of the businesses that collapsed were in the wholesale and retail segment. And 70% is a huge proportion of anything. And you begin to ask yourself, what are the challenges around this particular sector? And I know, Gilbert, that's not, you play in a very different, the services sector. But I would just like to, get some of your thinking around this, because I'd imagine, for example, in the wholesale and retail, because of the kind of logistics you're involved in, a lot of technicalities come in terms of just route to market, for example. Those maybe are some of the challenges they face, I don't know.
Just come again with the sector. It's a retail sector.
The wholesale and retail.
The wholesale and retail sector. One of the reasons why I personally decided not to go into brick and mortar businesses is because the first thing that comes with wholesale and retail is you have to mobilize capital upfront. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges that many entrepreneurs in that space usually tend to face, because you must have upfront capital for you to be able to participate, whether you are a producer of the goods that are going to be sold, whether you are a retail owner, a retail space owner, and so forth. However, that said, there are models that we have seen coming out of other countries, whereby they would focus on a specific niche market, create an ecosystem with suppliers, and have specific relationships with those suppliers in a way that doesn't force them to have upfront capital. But this is not yet enforced in our current economic landscape. We just don't have the necessary legal trust ecosystem to allow for those trust-based businesses to thrive. Because if, for example, someone defaults today, because actually the rate of defaults on such trust-based engagements is very high, then you are stuck with a legal system that takes too long to solve a problem. So you'll find that if you are just limited to having to raise capital upfront for anything in the retail and wholesale ecosystem. So I think by and large, that's probably the biggest challenge that you'll find in that space. The second challenge is that locally produced and locally manufactured products are just not competitive enough. You could strike a deal with a local manufacturer, but if you have to negotiate with someone in India or China, chances are you must have cash up front. So even if there was the opportunity, our manufacturing ecosystem is not just at a level where it can supply us with the goods and products we can sell and thrive in that space. So I think that any measure, any policy taken by the government to boost local manufacturing, and that's why I'm very excited that Made in Kenya is a big push now, because and I think it's long overdue, but that is really the key. The retail, wholesale ecosystem absolutely needs to be built on a local manufacturing landscape that is going to help local sellers and consumers to have access to better deals and better terms. When there was the 2009 economic crisis, if you recall, the US government decided to give a stimulus package to stimulate consumption, local consumption of locally produced goods. Well, goods in general, but by and large, they were trying to make sure that local producers, local manufacturers get money in their pocket, because that stimulated the whole economy, that stimulated the whole retail and wholesale ecosystem. And I think that we might need to start thinking in that direction. Strengthen local manufacturing and try to boost local consumption. Many other things, many other ripple effects, positive ripple effects will actually translate into other services like ours benefiting from that.
I see.
Yeah.
Eva, why wholesale and retail?
First of all, I just wanted to pick on something Gilbert has said and dissuade the notion that local is not competitive. I think today we have more shelf space allocated to local products, and obviously supermarkets would not be doing that if they did not see the uptake from consumers, which translates to quality. So it's something probably we've suffered as a nation where we lean to foreign items, but I strongly disagree that local products are not competitive. Having said that, the report you reference is a 2016 report. And around the same time, we had two large retailers in crisis. The well-known Nakumatt is an example. And for that ecosystem, consumer retail, it's one of the few where we have shared value, which means an impact downstream affects the entire value chain. So Nakumatt's ability to pay its suppliers on time has a cascading effect onto the producers, who are often the case, or producers or suppliers of the company, who are often the case entrepreneurs. And when two major retailers with the widest network and reach are in a crisis, then it has an effect on all the suppliers that feed into that, and that could have also contributed to that. And then finally, the margins really are so small in retail, and 2016 was pre-election, and then we went into an extended election period, which also affected the liquidity in the market, not to mention the credit crunch as a result of the interest rate capping. Yeah.
I see. Martin, on the same issue of wholesale and retail?
I think I concur with my panelists, and I would argue they probably also represent a big chunk of SMEs. So if we were to think of SMEs in general, every other SME will probably be a wholesaler or a retailer. If I think of kiosks, if I think of aggregators, so that might explain the numbers. I also wanted to build on that, maybe with a broader idea, suggestion, is really this notion of a digital marketplace. And this idea of globalization. As much as the rest of the world is in remission in terms of partnerships that span the globe, Kenya, East Africa seem to be expanding. Can we reimagine these wholesalers and retailers in a digital context? If I think of Facebook and one of their products, Instagram is apparently one of the biggest supermarkets. A lot of maybe individuals who work on here, who have all kinds of mobile products, have them displayed in Instagram. But how are they formalized? How are we thinking of that entire market? And then secondly, in the context of globalization, and I like what was alluded to, there was a bit of different perspectives. This notion of competitiveness, I think, should underpin everything we do. If traders and retailers can be globally competitive in terms of the efficiency, and if our products can be competitive, then the cycles we usually see in elections, at least not everybody is doing the elections every 5 years. So if literally somebody could map where elections not happening, and do we have an enabling environment that our traders and wholesalers can take advantage of those markets? I just wanted to throw those two ideas out there. And especially in our context in Strathmore, Dr. Njengo, Executive Dean, tends to think in that direction, is how do we become digital first? And how does the business school become global?
I see.
So that we can start opening up opportunities to address challenges that may be affecting these traders.
Actually, I'm told we have only 2 minutes to go, so very quickly wrapping up remarks, starting from here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I completely agree that our industries have become much more competitive than before. But I still look at it from the perspective of how many TV brands do we have? How many computer making companies do we have in Africa, in Kenya, for example? So I think in some categories of retail and wholesale, we are okay, but we are very far from where we need to be. And I think that the constraints we're discussing here ideally should help us to think about how do we boost that sector even more. We are doing well, but I think we have a long way to go.
Okay. Eva, very quickly.
All right. For me, my closing remarks would be looking at SMEs as a whole and to encourage us to be persistent. I think Rome is not built in a day. And so if we take the approach of consistency and what we've talked about here, think about the markets broadly beyond Kenya. And at least for capital, we look at East Africa as a single market. Your ability to demonstrate that your products can serve the Uganda market and the Tanzania market would help you get a leg up, maybe in terms of accessing capital, and to encourage our business owners to formalize their businesses, as it also gives them a competitive advantage while interacting with capital providers. And lastly, to think of capital or investors not just as capital providers, but as a resource for strategic guidance, which they can tap into.
Okay.
Yeah.
Martin?
My closing thoughts is, if we can think of a triple helix of government, industry, and academia in partnership with civil society citizens, reimagining SMEs so that they are globally competitive. And in the context of an institution like Strathmore, which is an entrepreneurial, outcome-oriented research university, how can we partner with government, with industry, continue all those partnerships, really to reimagine, not for Kenya, but for Africa and the globe. And particularly this issue of digital is one of my pet topics.
Yes.
Digitization, fourth industrial revolution, future of jobs. Can we position our SMEs to be global players?
I see.